What is going on, everybody? What is going on, the Catch fam? My name is John Dawson, and in today's video, we are hopping into our must-add waiver wire players for Week 4 of the 2022 fantasy football season. If you guys do enjoy today's content, be sure to hit that like button on the way in. Hit that subscribe button, of course, if you are new to the channel. We put out free daily fantasy football content. Really does help me out when you guys hit that like button and subscribe to the channel, and feel free to drop any comments, questions, concerns pertaining to the 2022 fantasy football season down below. Without further ado, let's hop right into today's video. All right, let's start with the running back position, which is short and sweet here in week 4. We have got 3 handcuffs who need to be rostered in 100% of fantasy football leagues. Let's start with Khalil Herbert, who is currently rostered in 47% of leagues. According to the Sleeper app, he had a monster day after David Montgomery left Sunday's matchup against the Texans. He went absolutely wild. We all knew this was a good matchup. I really liked Montgomery going into the afternoon, but Herbert sure made the most of it. 20 rushing attempts, 157 rushing yards, 2 scores. He added 2 receptions for 12 receiving yards. So really, regardless of if Monty is ready in week 4 or not, Herbert just needs to be rostered because of the risk that Monty holds as a player in terms of a potential re-injury. And we know how talented Herbert is. I mean, listen, it was a good matchup, so I'm not going to get too crazy here, but we know that Herbert can be an RB1. He is that talented, and if Montgomery misses any more time, whether it's week 4 or later in the season, Herbert is one of, if not the most valuable handcuffs in the entire NFL at the moment, and in all of fantasy football. He needs to be rostered, point blank, period. He is a top waiver wire addition moving into week 4. Speaking of valuable handcuffs in the league, Alexander Mattison, who's rostered in 64% of leagues. He's a little bit higher, I get it, but once again, Mattison needs to be rostered in 100% of leagues. We saw Dalvin Cook leave the game versus Detroit in week 3, and really, once again, it's the same situation as Herbert. It does not necessarily matter if Cook is ready to go in week 4 or not. Mattison is just that valuable of a handcuff and an automatic RB1 when Dalvin Cook is out. So Mattison didn't have that crazy of a day on the ground. 7 rushing attempts, 28 rushing yards, and 1 reception for 16 receiving yards. He gets the Saints in week 4 if Cook is still out. And, you know, it's a shoulder injury for Cook. We saw this last year, right? It could be a bad re-injury. So Khalil Herbert, Alexander Mattison absolutely are the most valuable handcuffs in fantasy football at the moment. They need to be rostered. Let's talk about Jamal Williams, who's rostered in 60% of leagues. So pretty high for Williams as well, right? But at the end of the day, man, he had 2 scores versus the Vikings, 20 rushing attempts, 87 rushing yards. He has been very good overall on the season. 16 fantasy points in week 1, then 7 in week 2, but we've seen enough of a pattern with the 2 scores in week 3 that Jamal Williams absolutely needs to be rostered 100% of fantasy football leagues. DeAndre Swift, who was sitting as RB3 going in to week 3, is now dealing with a possible shoulder injury, and even when Swift was playing, Jamal Williams was still playing very, very well. So Jamal Williams is right up there with Herbert and Mattison as one of the most valuable handcuffs in the entire league. I cannot stress how much I believe Herbert, Mattison, and Williams need to be rostered in 100% of fantasy football leagues, and how valuable they are in terms of week 4 waiver wire ads. All right, let's move on to the wide receiver position. This is going to be the beefiest portion of the entire video for today, so let's just try and get through this. All right, Greg Dortch, my guy Greggy D, we talked about him last week as a top receiver waiver wire ad going into week 3, and in week 3 he had his best fantasy day yet 17 points on the dot in full PPR, 10 targets, 9 receptions, 80 receiving yards. Listen, I know Rondale Moore missed this game as well. I know DeAndre Hopkins is still not out on the field, but I really just feel like Greg Dortch is really solidifying a nice role within this offense, continuing to build that chemistry with Kyler Murray at the quarterback position. I think especially in full PPR leagues, Greg Dortch has got to be a top waiver add. Even if that offense isn't great, they are throwing the football enough and in enough game scripts where they have to pass the football that Greg Dortch is absolutely valuable right now. I really like him as a top waiver add moving into week 4. Let's talk about Mack Hollins. Apparently the #1 receiver for the Raiders. A monster game. 10 targets, 8 receptions, 158 receiving yards, and a score in week 3 versus Tennessee. Is just under 30 fantasy points in full PPR. He had a nice stat line in week 2, finishing at 11.6 fantasy points. He's rostered in 3% of leagues. Listen, guys, I don't know how consistent Mack Hollins' stat lines are going to be on a week-to-week basis, but especially in deeper leagues, he's at least worth a look. He gets Denver and Kansas City before the bye week. Then he has Houston, New Orleans, Jacksonville. So there's some good matchups coming up. I don't know what to exactly make out of this Raiders offense, but hey, like I said, in deeper leagues, take a look at Mack Hollins. Why not? Stats over the last 2 weeks have been good enough to at least consider him. All right, Tyler Boyd is rostered in 67% of fantasy leagues. It really should be higher. I mean, Tyler Boyd, one of my favorite receivers in terms of late round value going into the season. Listen, he's a great handcuff at the receiver position. God forbid anything happened to T. Higgins or Jamar Chase. Boyd just holds extreme value, you know, if one of those guys goes down, but it really hasn't mattered that neither of those guys have gone down on the season. After 13.3 fantasy points in week 1, 5.7 in week 2, he had 20.5 in week 3 against the Jets. 5 targets, 4 receptions, 105 receiving yards, and a score. If Tyler Boyd is floating around, it's just plain and simple, he needs to be rostered. All right, let's talk about Russell Gage. You had to step up essentially as the wide receiver 1 for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers in their loss in week 3 against Green Bay. He had 13 targets, 12 receptions, 87 receiving yards, and a score. I think this is an add in deeper leagues overall. He is rostered in 48% of leagues, and this is really, you know, just looking at the fact that Godwin is still hurt, Mike Evans has been injury prone, and Julio so far on the season has been injury prone as well. In deeper leagues, full PPR leagues, I think you can consider Russell Gage moving forward. There is a potential that he carves out a nice role in that offense after proving himself to Tom Brady in their week 3 loss. Let's talk about my guy Romeo Doubs. Talk about a breakout game potentially against Tampa Bay. 20.3 fantasy points, 8 targets, 8 receptions. You love to see that. You know, Aaron Rodgers loves to see that. 73 receiving yards and a score against New England, the Giants, the Jets, Washington in the next coming weeks. I do think that Romeo Doubs could be a great add overall. We want to see a more consistent pattern emerge, but overall he's absolutely worth rostering and leaving on the bench for the time being. Isaiah McKenzie of the Buffalo Bills had a nice fantasy day, 21.2 fantasy points against Miami, 9 targets, 7 receptions, 76 receiving yards, and a score. So far, he has scored in week 1 and week 3. He is definitely the solidified wide receiver 3 for this team, and he's playing his best football when Stephon Diggs and Gabe Davis are both out on the field. So I like McKenzie moving forward. He gets Baltimore, Pittsburgh, and Kansas City before the week 7 bye. And obviously you want pieces of that Buffalo Bills offense on your fantasy roster. I do think that Isaiah McKenzie is absolutely worth the add moving into week 4. We've got Zay Jones of the Jacksonville Jaguars, a team we need to start taking a closer look at as a serious contender if all of their players stay healthy. Zay Jones had 12.5 fantasy points in week 1, 5.3 in week 2, and then 24.5 in week 3 against The Chargers, 11 targets, 10 receptions, a score, and 85 receiving yards. He led the team in receiving yards in week 3. We know what Christian Kirk has done on the season. He's playing very good football. Marvin Jones also had a pretty good day at 13.3 fantasy points. This is a receiving core to pay attention to moving forward on the season, but Zay Jones looks like the next best option in terms of consistency, and we need to take that more seriously. Let's talk about Josh Palmer, who has emerged as a nice fantasy option since Keenan Allen has not been able to take the field. 13 points in week 2 versus Kansas City, 15.9 in week 3 against Jacksonville. 9 targets, 6 receptions, 99 receiving yards overall. He gets Houston, Cleveland, Denver, and Seattle in the coming weeks. And the question here is, can Josh Palmer carve out a nice role within this offense as a true wide receiver 3 when Keenan Allen comes back from injury and still continue to be productive? I do think it's definitely possible, so I like Palmer in full PPR leagues and deeper leagues overall. I do think he's worth the look moving into week 4. And let's talk about my guy, Josh Reynolds of the Detroit Lions. Now, he did suffer a low ankle sprain in week 3, so he's definitely at the bottom of today's list, but in the last 2 weeks, he's performed very well from a fantasy standpoint. 12.8 points in week 2, 15.6 in week 3 versus Minnesota, 10 targets, 6 receptions, 96 receiving yards. So keep an eye on Josh Reynolds in your deeper leagues and full PPR leagues if he is deemed healthy. I mean, the chemistry between him and Jared Goff is very real. We know that the Lions lost in week 3, but this is still an offense that's kind of humming right now that we want to keep a close eye on overall. Like I said, full PPR, deeper leagues, if Reynolds is healthy, I think he's a nice waiver wire addition moving in to week 4. All right, let's move on to quarterbacks and tight ends. We talked about the Jacksonville Jaguars just a moment ago. We talked about Trevor Lawrence moving into week 3 as a viable streaming option, especially for those of you who were concerned about the Justin Herbert situation. And guess what? Trevor Lawrence had his best game of the season so far. 25.18 fantasy points, 39 passing attempts, 28 completions, 262 passing yards, and 3 touchdowns. He added 3 rushing attempts for 7 rushing yards, but most importantly, no turnovers for Trevor Lawrence in week 3. He gets Philadelphia in week 4. It's a steep matchup, I get it. Then he gets Houston, Indianapolis, and the Giants. So I don't love him in week 4. But hey, the Chargers defense looked pretty good moving into week 3, and he played very well against them. So I just think overall, if you're in a tough position at the quarterback position, and luckily, unlike week 1 where we saw Prescott go down, and week 2 where we saw Trey Lance go down, so far we haven't seen any major injuries to the position. But overall, if you're still looking for a starting quarterback, I do think we can consider Trevor Lawrence. Like I said, there's something humming over there in Jacksonville. This offense looks very good, so I am a fan of Lawrence moving in to week 4. Let's talk about Jared Goff. He had a disappointing day. He was another one of my favorite streamers at the position. 14.8 fantasy points against Minnesota. 41 passing attempts, 25 completions, 277 passing yards, 1 passing touchdown, 1 interception. I still like Jared Goff moving forward against Seattle in week 4. I still think he's a streaming option overall in week 4. Unlike Carson Wentz, who kind of came back to earth in week 3, and Joe Flacco, who came back to earth in week 3. I like Trevor Lawrence. I like Jared Goff. I think they're still viable streaming options moving forward. We'll see what happens with guys like Flacco and Carson Wentz, who I really thought would have a better game against his former team, and gosh, did the Eagles think differently. All right, let's move on to tight ends. There's a couple names I want to go over. We've got Tyler Conklin, who, we just talked about Joe Flacco maybe not being much of an option, but his tight end 1 is absolutely an option at this point in the season. So far, Tyler Conklin's sitting at tight end 11 overall, and that was before his 16.4 performance against Cincinnati. 10.6 points in week 1, 9 in week 2, 16.4 in week 3, 8 targets, 8 receptions, 84 receiving yards, especially in full PPR leagues. Conklin is worth a look. He gets Pittsburgh in week 4, who just gave up a monster game to David Njoku. I'm a fan of Tyler Conklin at the moment. All right, let's talk about Njoku very quickly here. I do think that this was a result of the coverage and the game script that we saw against Pittsburgh, but he had a monster game on Thursday Night Football with 23.9 fantasy points, 10 targets, 9 receptions, 89 receiving yards, and a score. And he gets Atlanta in week 4, so I do like the matchup in week 4, but just be a little bit hesitant here at David Njoku. I do think that we could see some up and down action throughout the season, but he's definitely worth a waiver wire addition at this point with the amount of points and the productivity we saw against Pittsburgh in week 3. All right, Tyler Higbee is on here. He is rostered in 81% of leagues, but if he's still floating around, I do think Higbee needs to be rostered. Only drew 4 targets against Arizona. He did have 4 receptions and 61 receiving yards. So at this point, he has 10.1 fantasy points in week 3, 14.1 in week 2, and 8.9 in week 1. Overall, he has 20 targets, 12 receptions, 110 receiving yards on the year. I like Higbee in full PPR leagues. I really think he needs to be rostered in 100% of leagues at this point in the season. And that'll do it for today's video. Let me know in the comments down below who is your top waiver priority moving into week 4 of the 2022 fantasy football season. Be sure to hit that like button on the way out and hit that subscribe button, of course, if you are new to the channel. With that, I'll say thank you guys so much for watching and or listening, and remember, you saw it here on The Catch.